Hi there, everybody, and thank you for joining me, Bruce Hallas, your host here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast for episode 3 in our first series. For those of you who are new to the podcast and the series, the podcast objective is to look at the challenges and to provide some insights into how we as information security professionals can more effectively raise awareness, influence positive security behaviours, and embed security within organisational cultures. So how have we gone about doing that? We lined up this great list of guests who all have one thing in common, which is that they're all from outside of the security industry. The other thing that they have in common is that they all have either experience or skill sets which are focused around raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an appropriate organisational or even national culture. And what we're trying to do within this podcast is to invite those guests in, share their insights over the space of an hour so that you can walk away with 3, 4, or 5 key points to take away and to consider within the context of the organizations that you work with day in and day out. Right now, over in the United States, in Vegas, we had the Black Hat Conference going on. And yesterday I picked up a news article on the BBC which referred to Alex Stamos, who was delivering the keynote presentation on his views around information security and his views around industry approaches to information security. And I just felt that Alex really did hit the nail on the head in that he was emphasizing the need to really focus on the human side of things rather than technology. And that is very much, core to what we're trying to do here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. And one of the key things that Alex mentions amongst all the great stuff that he had to say was the need for empathy. And the reason why I felt it was worth raising in this particular podcast is that our guest today reflects upon the need for empathy. And that when empathy is missing from the development and delivery of communications, those communications are less effective in terms of influencing behaviour and fostering an appropriate culture. And so, I just saw those two linked today and I just thought I needed to give a heads up or recognise what Alex had to say. I think what he's suggesting the industry needs to do is absolutely spot on, but also it's a natural link into our next guest, John Pollock. Now, John and I go back a couple of years ago. We both had a real interest in terms of the analogies. So I set up a not-for-profit organisation called the Analogies Project, which has been running now for about 5 years. John became aware of the Analogies Project, and with our combined passion for analogies and understanding the science behind analogies and why they work in terms of being an effective communication tool and or means of influence behaviour, meant that we've had several conversations now. And I just felt that his experience would be worth sharing with the community. And he volunteered, he said, yeah, I'll do it, to come and share some thoughts. But a little bit about John. John's background's really interesting. He started off in journalism, and then one of the peaks of his career has got to be the fact that he was writing speeches for the ex-US President Bill Clinton. So he's got some really interesting insights of the challenges that we face in terms of creating policy and then communicating that. Quite similar in many ways to Gregory Michaelidos, who was in the first interview that we did here on the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. Now, John's going to explain more about himself. So I think what we'll do now is we'll just crack on with that interview. And I really hope you find it interesting. Get your pen out, get a piece of paper, write 3 or 4 key points down, just to make sure that you walk away from the interview with a couple of things for you to consider. I hope you enjoy it. I know I did. I know John did. And I'm absolutely convinced you'd love to come back on again. Maybe we could start off with a really nice, easy opening question, John. You come from a really interesting background. You've been involved in journalism. You've been involved in speech writing. Do you want to just give us the John Pollock history in terms of where the journey you've been on to date has got you to this point where you're now helping organisations and leaders within organisations to communicate more effectively to bring around change?
Sure. I came out of a background in journalism, first as a reporter and editor at university, and then at newspapers and eventually overseas for different publications in the Associated Press, and then shifted back in the United States to politics, campaigns, and then eventually into political speechwriting, and then segued into consulting in the private sector. And the common thread that runs through all of those endeavors, in retrospect, is storytelling. How do you convey information succinctly in a way that captures people's attention? Because whether you are writing an article or you're giving a speech or you're selling a product, if you can't capture people's attention and hold it quickly, then you've lost. And storytelling is the core of all these endeavors, and often analogy plays a central role in the stories we tell.
And do you see there's a difference between storytelling and analogy, or do you think they are one and the same, interchangeable?
Well, all stories are not analogies, but all analogies are stories. An analogy is a story with a spring-loaded conclusion, and it's a story that leads and sometimes misleads listeners to a given conclusion.
And when you think back to all those roles that you've had, starting off in journalism and then moving over into politics and campaign, communication, and then sort of into the consultancy piece that is now your life, at what point do you think you really understood the power of storytelling? Was it, at the beginning of this journey, or was it only through experiencing the effect of good storytelling through communication that you then realised this stuff really works?
I think that I always loved stories. I grew up on stories, and my parents read to me when I was very young. And then, of course, I started reading on my own, and I always loved stories. And I think if you listen to enough stories and you read enough stories, you start to recognize good ones right away, stories with potential. And sometimes they're very unexpected. For example, when I worked at the Hartford Courant in Connecticut, usually I covered the sewer commission on Tuesday nights in a small town called Bristol. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, it wasn't so interesting to me, although it was important as a record of government to cover. Mm-hmm. And then one day there was another story. There were rumors of a three-legged coyote killing sheep in the only flock left in Connecticut. And right away, I knew that was a great story, a three-legged coyote killing the last flock of sheep in Connecticut. It's so absurd and so riveting that I set out to get to the bottom of this story. And indeed, there was a three-legged coyote who had apparently been trapped once and chewed off its own leg and was very wary and wily as a result and was determined not to be killed or captured again. In the end, the coyotes lost. But it was a great story. And did it matter? Maybe to the sheep and the shepherd, but it spoke to people in an emotional way that the sewer commission didn't.
I can imagine.
So I would say perhaps that we ought all to be looking out for the three-legged coyote in our life and the world around us and keep our eye out for ways to capture people's attention, because capturing people's attention and holding it is the essence of communication.
Now, you just made a really interesting distinction there, capturing people's attention and then maintaining it. And you clearly differentiated between the two. Do you see them as separate objectives in themselves and requiring something different to achieve both of those effectively?
Yes, because you can certainly capture someone's attention by offending them, by any number of means that might not advance your ultimate goals. And so I think that maintaining someone's attention is often a more complex and nuanced endeavor. And therein lies the art of communication. Do many people fail at capturing people's attention? Sure, we ignore most ads that come our way. We ignore most newspaper articles that we encounter. And we ignore so much out of necessity. So I don't want to minimize capturing people's attention, but maintaining it and then beginning the process of informing and persuading, that's more complex.
It's a reflection of the fact that we all lead really very busy lives. We all receive a lot of communication of information. Some, and only some of that, we will actually engage with effectively. But then shortly afterwards, only a small amount of that interest will be maintained long enough to actually achieve the objective of the communication in the first place. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and among my many jobs in years past, when I was young, I spent 2 summers working in a restaurant, actually as a strolling violinist. And the chef with whom I was friends told me something really important because I commented that his plates looked so beautifully presented. And he said, listen, people eat twice, once with their eyes and once with their mouth. And you need to make sure that they're both are taken care of. And I think that you could make the analogy between a beautiful plate of food. It has to look good and it has to taste good and hopefully be nutritious and leave someone feeling satisfied. And that is true of communication too. You need to pique someone's interest in consuming what you have to offer and then making sure the meat of your argument is palatable and nutritious.
And if I was to stretch that analogy a little bit further, I guess what I would say is that the experience of eating it both with your eyes and your mouth would then have to, if it's a good experience, people will come back to your restaurant and buy more.
Yes, that's a great extension of the analogy.
Yeah. And
the better the analogy, the more extensions and parallels one can see and put to good use.
So good communication really, from that, good communication needs to be about planning that whole journey so that the end product in terms of the behavior you're trying to influence, that experience is an experience that the consumer, the audience, if you want to think of it that way, that they thoroughly enjoy, and that you have to plan in for that, and once they've enjoyed it, how do you get them back to the restaurant?
Yeah, and I think that part of that cannot be entirely planned. Some of it is intuitive, but what you're really trying to do is build a relationship. You're trying to build trust. You're trying to build an exchange. And I think that too much communication is, we're in such a hurry to tell you what we want you to know that we don't listen and observe as much as we ought to. And so it's that give and take that requires patience and investments on everyone's part. So maybe somebody who comes into your restaurant and tries their old favorite, the next time they come, they'll be willing to try the special of the day, which is somewhat experimental, and start to expand their palate and their ability to learn.
Mm-hmm. Now, just going back to a comment you made earlier, you were pointing out that communication is as much about listening and observing as it is about actually communicating to somebody. It reminds me of a book I was reading recently by Erin Meyer, and she was talking about how there was somebody she knew from China, and that individual's mum had basically brought him up on the understanding that, there is a reason why you only have one mouth and 2 eyes and 2 ears. When you think about all the roles you've had in terms of communicating, from journalism through to writing speeches on behalf of Bill Clinton, how important has that final bit of the loop been when creating those speeches, when creating those communications?
I think that the best speechwriters are the best listeners, because you need to be able to put yourself in the seats of the audience and hear the speech. And that's why you should always read your speeches aloud, or at least be able to hear how they sound aloud. Because things written on a page are always different than when spoken aloud. And second, to come from a place of empathy. And that doesn't mean that a good speech panders to an audience, because you should never pander. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't challenge an audience to see things from your perspective or in a new way. But it means framing those challenges in ways that have the potential to resonate emotionally and resonate intellectually. And that takes some thought to think about something from another person's perspective. And if you look at the people who are most persuasive, they tend to be the people who are best at analogy, because they're good at framing something that is in one realm in terms of another that perhaps resonates more with the audience. Mm-hmm. And that comes from a place of listening intellectually, listening emotionally.
Mm. Can I ask you, because one of the challenges that I know a lot of our listeners face is the need to communicate to audiences, personnel that are often spread across the globe in different nations with different cultures, but you might have a single core message around cybersecurity. When you think back to what you did as a speechwriter, you were working on behalf of the United States government, creating speeches which could be delivered to audiences within the US, the whole of the US, and potentially much broader than that to, nation states and their own populations. They were all going to consume this story that you were telling. How did you take into consideration, or did you take into consideration, those different cultural aspects?
That's a good question. Obviously, speeches and most communications today, with the amount of hacking that go on, things that we say and express outside of our minds, either in writing or verbally, have the potential to reach a global audience, whether we want that or not. And so one has to think about what is it we're trying to say? How simple can you make it without making it dumb? Because people are smart the world over. They don't want to be treated like idiots. On the other hand, as you know, there is a lot of room for misinterpretation. And so one needs to choose words carefully and choose stories carefully and be explicit about the conclusion at times that you want people to draw. One of President Clinton's strengths as a communicator is that he would tell the story of an individual who is perhaps confronting a health crisis and the burden of paying for them. And there are 487,000 people just like him. And this is what we're going to do. So it was speaking to the human element about an individual, but then helping people draw the broader truth from that situation.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, it does. But I think the other thing you just brought in there is that human element. And one of the guests that we've interviewed was a lady called Heather from a comic strip called The Singer. And one of the things that she pointed out was how sometimes corporate communication strips out the human element.
Oh, it strips out emotion all the time. I used to say that Washington is where good words go to die. Having worked in the corporate arena, I can say an equal number of good words meet their end in the corporate world as well. It's like the difference between artificial creamer and real cream. People can tell the difference. That something that has been constituted from chemicals or something that comes from a cow. They taste different. One is better than the other. And I think that there's a tendency toward conservatism in communication that perhaps limits your downside, but in the process creates a new downside and that you sound like a robot. Human resources, for example, as a field, often focuses on the resources and not on the human. And that comes through in HR communications often, whether it's about benefits or it's about the euphemisms that a company might use to announce layoffs or cutbacks. And the more that people remember we're all people, just give us the truth, the better off we are.
It's interesting because it is a theme that I see in a lot of the research that I've done, the importance of you use the words empathy with the audience, the importance of understanding that actually people's decisions will be very much driven by their values, which is often a result of their experiences in life to date. And that whole stripping away those things from the communication may end up with a series of messages which are very in line with the corporate guidelines, but they fail to achieve the objective, which is to engage with people and to maintain their levels of awareness on the particular message that you've had. I think it's interesting to see this consistent theme coming through, this lack of the human element in the communication piece itself.
Yes, and I would add on this, if you think of the word itself, a corporation, which is essentially an embodiment. It is an analogy that we are making between an organization and a person, as in the famous words of Mitt Romney, hey, corporations are people too, my friend. If a corporation is essentially assuming the responsibilities of a being, an organizational being, it cannot at the same time expect disembodied communications to resonate well with flesh and blood people. And if you look at the most successful companies, they tend to be those that communicate with people and speak to their higher aspirations. Let's take two disparate examples. One would be Apple, which speaks to people's spirit of possibility and creativity. And when you open an Apple product, the instructions are minimal and elegant and friendly. Let's take another company, say Zappos, the shoe company. Again, it says, hey, we know that shoes sometimes don't fit or they don't necessarily look good. Return them to us, no questions asked. And they mean that. And those are two very different companies, but the way they communicate is similar in that it's very human and speaks to the human experience.
And do you think it's also the way they communicate, it's consistent communication and also a commitment? You just raised the point there with Zappos, and they say, if you send the shoes back if they don't fit or whatever, and they really do mean it. And it's a sense of a commitment to the message. So it's not just a message to almost appease or to appeal. It's also a commitment to that message as well. Do you think that consistency and commitment are really important factors when it comes to engaging successfully with people?
Yes, because it's all about, do you mean what you say? And therein is the essence of credibility. Is if your words and your actions align, then people know what to expect. If your words and your actions don't align, people know what to expect. And that's inconsistency and perhaps disappointment. So there's a great company that I do business with, I'm a customer. It's Zingerman's, right. Which is a gourmet deli in my hometown of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And they have a restaurant and a large mail order business. And if you receive a product, they'll ask you, what did you think of it? And recently I was honest and said, well, I thought that the write-up in the catalog was better than the product. And they wrote back and said, oh, we're sorry to hear that. What can we do to make it right? And I was impressed. Did I ask that anything be done? No. I felt that their response was ample. But that's a consistent practice of, if it's not right, we'll make it right. And that acknowledgement was, in my mind, making it right. And that acknowledgement was very human.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to your website and a couple of things that you raised in there, work that you've been doing for quite some time. When I read the website again, I remember reading your original website a couple of years ago when we first spoke, and then thinking, what you do for me were all things that every member of the information security community, there was a potential that it could be of some interest. And yes, they might be getting it right. Maybe there are opportunities for improvement. And the one thing that came straight to my mind is the fact that you talk about helping individuals eliminate unnecessary jargon from their communication. And in our industry, for quite some time, there was this, and it's probably still existent, there's a sense of often people would get lost in the jargon used by the industry when it came to communicating and educating and raising awareness. And I just wonder whether or not there is anything, some bullet points you might be able to share with us in terms of the challenge of jargon and how to try and strip that out. And, this is the type of benefits you can get from that.
Well, I think that jargon is a problem in just about every industry. And jargon is helpful to the extent that it offers shorthand. And it's not helpful in that if you can't put something into plain English, then you probably haven't thought it through enough. And if you can't explain it over the dinner table to your uncle or your cousin, you probably haven't given enough thought to communication, because obviously nuclear physics is very complicated, but a good communicator can translate that through analogy to something that the layperson can understand, at least at the level that they need to understand it. So I always push people to explain something. Can you explain it in a different way? If you were really to boil it down, what do you mean to say? What does this word mean? And I think that if there's a $10 word or a 10 quid word, you need to look at how can we do it in a smaller denomination that is simpler and more direct. But I will say this. I was reading the paper today in anticipation of our interview. I read it every day, but I was paying particular attention to stories involving cybersecurity. And the word virus came up, and spam, and Trojan horse. And one could call those jargon, but I would not. I think they're very descriptive terms that translate something that's potentially very complex and alien to most people into terms that they can understand and know that a virus can be very dangerous. Most people know what a Trojan horse is, and spam as well, although most people don't eat spam on a regular basis. It's still in the store, and it's not very good meat, but it's fairly ubiquitous. So I think that, it's okay to use terms of art, but they ought to be very clear in their meaning. And if a layperson is not going to understand, then one might consider looking for new ways of describing things.
So in effect, it's, jargon actually has value when the audience understands that. So you could have industry discussion that's going on, between people working within the same industry, and they understand that jargon, and it's a shortcut, which, makes the performance, the efficiency of the communication, it can improve it. If you're communicating outside your industry, you've got to be aware that sometimes people can get lost in the jargon. But on the flip side, if people more broadly out there understand jargon, and a lot of that's driven through, means of education, whether that be, unstructured like media, for example, or through actual educational systems, when people become more familiar with that jargon, it becomes part of the lexicon for everybody, and you can continue to use that. But until you've got to that point, using jargon from within industry discussions and taking it outside, you run the risk of losing the audience's attention.
Yes, and I would add that oftentimes jargon is used to obscure muddled thinking. And the number of times I hear the word strategic or leverage or deliverable or a lot of $10 words that make one sound official and knowledgeable often obscure a lack of strategy and a lack of clarity about what actually is being done or not being done. And so while I love eloquence, I believe most eloquence can be achieved with small words and direct sentences. And if something is crystal clear, to use an analogy, then it's okay to ask, what do you mean by that? Can you put that a different way? I don't understand. Or could you expand on this point? And it doesn't have to be antagonistic, but just helping nudge people to explain things another way might draw out important details or might spark the person to say, I'm not sure. I think I mean X. And then that's a whole nother discussion. But the language we use and that we permit really can take us in directions that are positive, or it can take us into a tributary that we don't want to go.
Last week, I was over in Amsterdam, and we were having a presentation around the issue of culture. And I know that the use of language in terms of helping an organisation with its own internal culture, in terms of maybe defining where it is at the moment and where they want it to be, and then how is language going to be part of that. That's something that I know that you have a real interest in, and you've had that interest for quite some time. Why is language so important to an organization's culture?
I think language is important to an organization's culture because it defines how we communicate. It defines how we interact in many ways. And so being aware of the language we use is very, very important. And it doesn't mean that one size fits all, that language that's appropriate for one situation is appropriate for another. But if we are aware of the language we use and how we use it to reinforce, we gain greater command over it and we start using it more deliberately. I remember being in a shop in India, and I was a boy, and my parents had been on me for mumbling lately. I hadn't been articulating my words. And the shopkeeper heard me ask my mom a question, and he said, "Oh, how interesting. What language is he speaking?" And I was humiliated, absolutely humiliated. And from then on, I tried not to mumble as much. And that's the language of learning the lessons of how we speak. That really hammered it home to speak carefully, more carefully.
It sounds like a great plant by your mum and dad there. But
yeah, I think it was just life teaching me a lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about language, and you sort of point out that you might have English as a language, but then you have these different strands of English. So you have English within the professional context, English maybe with the family and friends, and then English in a context which might be non-professional, non-family friends, just people that you've never met before, but it falls out of those two categories. I've heard it said, and part of the research that I've done on the issues of culture is that language is the fundamental, it's the foundations of culture, because it's how we experience, other than visually, it's one of the key ways that we experience everything around us. And as such, it's a channel for making us aware of the, our national culture, for example, or even our industry culture or our professional culture. It's how we experience things around us. So would you be of the opinion that the language we use is a foundation of culture?
It's certainly central to culture, because if you look at the different subcultures in a larger society, they are defined. Take pop music, take rap, take a language of any group, and it's going to vary. Even in today's homogenized world, language defines our thoughts, defines who we are, it defines how we interact with other people. And I think one of the great benefits of English, and one of the reasons that English has come to dominate the world as the common currency of communication, is because it is so extraordinarily flexible and adaptable, and it absorbs so much from other languages. When the French conquered England, English acquired 10,000 French words. And when the Norse swept down even earlier and took over the Saxons, they brought Norse words. Haggle, for example, is a Norse word. Not is a Norse word, and there are many others. And when the English colonized India, then words like shampoo and khaki entered the English lexicon. And so in a world that depends increasingly on adaptation and flexibility, English is perhaps the most flexible language in use today. And while there may be others that I'm not aware of, it's a gymnast, and that's what makes it so useful to so many people.
I was reading somewhere that English and countries where English is the prime spoken language, that those countries their language tends to be a lot more direct. But the reason why they can be that much more direct is the actual size of the language in terms of number of words means that you get words and you can find the specific words for the specific scenario that you're trying to talk about. Whereas if you go to some of the more sort of, I guess, Latin and Romantic type of languages in Europe, for example, you find you have a smaller number of words, but then suddenly you get this different context. You're not just listening for the words, you're trying to understand the words within the context of the message and the scenario that you're in. When you think about communication, is that something that you've experienced as well, that these different languages that we're using to communicate to people, whether they be speeches, written word, a script for an animation or a short film, that actually you've got, English gives you that flexibility, whereas other languages require you to actually listening and pay attention to the context around the words as well? Well,
it's interesting that you raise this issue, because one of the exercises I give to myself is I often read the ingredients or instructions on foods and assembly instructions on products in different languages to see how they go about issuing the exact same information but in different ways. And I was just doing it yesterday, and I'm trying to think of the product and I can't, but I was noting that, wow, English takes a lot fewer words to say this than Spanish does. And obviously I don't have the knowledge to read Mandarin, for example. My one semester of Mandarin did not leave me with a lot except the four tones. But My understanding is that Mandarin, with its pictographic representations, there's a lot of specificity in each character, but they're not nearly as flexible as the phonetic alphabet, which lets you combine an infinite variety to create new words very quickly. So one of the benefits of English is that it, like many of the other less efficient languages, is based on, descended from the North Semitic alphabet, which was the first phonetic alphabet in human history. And the unique culture surrounding English and American English is its capacity to keep adapting and keep changing. And you can dictate what people can say or can't say, but you have a much harder time dictating what people are allowed to mean and can't mean. And that's why censorship tends to fail in the long run, because language will find a way around the artificial constrictions that governments try to place upon it.
To place on it, yeah. Okay. In your book, Shortcuts, you talk about the power of analogy to help both engage and persuade an audience and key stakeholders. Why is it you think that analogy itself is such an effective tool, but also one that sometimes I wonder whether or not people really realise the value of analogy? Well, one of the things that we do at the Analogies Project, we're quite active upon raising awareness about analogy and the power of analogy. And often we find, in an audience, we'll ask people how many people here use analogy. And often we see people put their hands up. But one of the gap between I use it, but I don't really understand why it works. It seems to work, but I don't know why it works. And part of what we try to do at the project is to sort of introduce that science behind the analogy, we call it. Because we think it's really, like you, we think it's a great way of engaging and a great way of influencing. But I was just wondering if you can share for the community who haven't engaged with the Analogies Project in the past, why does it work? Why is it such an influential tool? And maybe use some of the examples from the book that you've written.
Well, I would start by saying that one of the reasons that humans have done so well in the evolutionary struggle is our capacity for analogy. While others might recognize patterns such as camouflage. And so animals might seek to blend in with their surroundings, or they might seek to mimic something that their chief predator finds threatening or unappetizing. Only humans are able to see deeper intellectual scaffolding between two situations and build upon that. And let's take an example of one of the greatest innovations in human history, and that is the moving assembly line. Bill Clan was a knockabout mechanic who had worked in a wide range of industries, moving from job to job as jobs came and went. And he ended up at Ford Motor Company. And Ford Motor Company at that time was one of many startups building a new product called the automobile. And it was a very laborious, time-intensive process that took 12 or 13 hours to build one car. And Bill came back to Detroit after a trip to Chicago, where he had taken a tour of the Swift meatpacking plant and saw butchers taking apart carcasses of pigs and cattle as they hung on hooks on overhead trolleys. And each butcher did a specialized cut and pushed on down the line to the next butcher who took off another part. And Clan came back and told his boss, I know how we can build cars a lot faster. And he explained this process of disassembly. And the boss said, so what? And he said, don't you see? It's the same thing, assembly or disassembly. It's the process. And the boss was dubious, and Clan had to persuade him. And in the end, they put in a line to assemble engine blocks. And on the first day, there was an accident, and it snapped a man's femur right above the knee. And they stopped the line, and the boss comes down and says, listen, if all you're going to do is break legs, we're going to stop this. And Clan, who stood to lose yet another job, just begged him. And they spent an hour walking him up and down and explaining the benefits of moving assembly. And at the end, the boss looked at them and said, break all their legs. And they started the line up again. And in less than a year, it took that assembly process from over 12 hours down to 90 minutes per car. Now, what did that do? That allowed them to produce a lot more cars, a lot faster. So they got economies of scale and could sell them for a lot less money. And that process of moving assembly was soon copied not just by every other car company, but every other manufacturer. And it was that deep analogy between disassembly of hogs and assembly of fill in the blank that completely unlocked the economic potential of the 20th century and transformed the way manufacturing and many other processes are undertaken. And it's that type of breakthrough and that type of thinking, analogical thinking, that sets people apart.
Yeah. One of the powers of analogy is the ability to take something from, outside of the cybersecurity industry and to say, look, it's the same objective that we want to get to. Where have other people outside of cybersecurity got it right, be more efficient or more effective? What lessons can we learn and bring you within our industry to help with the challenge of communicating with people effectively, engaging with them, and not only engaging with them, but maintaining that level of awareness? And that's where the podcast comes from. It's this reaching out to people outside the industry and going, can you share with us your experience so that we can potentially apply that through analogy to the challenges that we face? And it is a great analogy. And that's in the book, isn't it? Shortcuts.
Yes. And I one great example has to do with British efforts to increase the survival rates of their bomber pilots and their bombers during World War II. And R.B. Jones, who is the head of scientific intelligence for the Air Ministry, was tasked with the job of figuring out a way to make British bombers invisible to radar. And he struggled with a number of different approaches, but in the end said, I'm thinking about this all wrong. Where do you hide a grain of sand? You hide it on a beach. So instead of trying to hide the aircraft, he decided to make it look like there were millions of aircraft and started dropping buckets and buckets and buckets of chaff. And that was tremendously successful. Eventually, the Germans developed some countermeasures to it, but it really was helpful in some of the key bombing campaigns that helped turn the tide of the war. In the end, it was a technical solution, but the insight wasn't technical. The insight came from a simple analogy. And so the point is, or the lesson is that the answers to our challenges are determined in some part by how we frame the challenges. And when Steve Jobs set out to build a bicycle for the mind and create the Mac, that analogy, that idea of letting people do with the machine and amplify their power, their creative powers in this case, but give them the freedom to do that. That was a very profound approach to an industry that thought about computers and who would use them and how they would be used in a completely different way. And that, in turn, helped revolutionize the way people communicate in the world because it made computers accessible to non-techies.
So do you think that Steve Jobs designed the Mac from the user perspective, or did he come up with a different way of designing something? Because it's not, the whole concept of designing something with the audience in mind makes a lot of sense. And then there's people that just come up with great design. Do you think he sort of said, I'm building something here for the customer, for this particular market? Or do you think their design team just designed something that was great and they just took it out there and wondered if it would stick?
Well, I think that Steve Jobs was famously self-confident in his own sense of design and somewhat disdainful of designers who tried to market research things to death and design what they thought people wanted. Steve Jobs often knew what people wanted. Now, of course, there are many people in the history of business who knew what people wanted and they were wrong and their companies went out of business. So knowing is not necessarily being correct.
Yep.
But in the case of Jobs, I think he trusted that people were creative, that they were smart, and that they were intuitive. And if you gave them a tool that was intuitively easy to use, that they would put it to great use. And in thinking of a personal computer as a bicycle for the mind, that once you quickly learn to ride, you can take it anywhere and put it to any number of great uses and get places and do things a lot faster with less effort. That was not something that IBM would ever have set out to do. because IBM sold to corporations, and they did not sell to creative individuals as their prime market. And to the extent that Apple has been held back in the world of corporate computing, that's because they don't philosophically aim toward a corporate mentality. They aim to empower creative individuals. And then, of course, that led to whole new approaches to the cell phone. And if you look at the iPhone and the way you scroll through things, it's very analogous to flipping through pages. And in fact, the analogy to scroll comes from a medieval form of documentation. Scratch that, make it biblical. The Dead Sea Scrolls. And so by giving people simple ways to think about new technology, familiar ways to think about new technology, they empower them to use it.
Right. Okay. Well, I've exhausted myself. I'm mentally exhausted. Just the excitement of listening to you, and also stretching me, making me think, just as the books have made me think, and the TEDx chat as well made me think when I first sort of came across you. I found this really useful. I really do think that the security industry and the community that we're building around the podcast will find a lot of what you've said very relevant to the challenges that they face. I mean, after all, what you help organizations do is, to get that communication right with the objective of, engaging effectively with the audience, and then to sort of influence stakeholders. And that's what you've been doing all your life. And the obvious bit that, sticks out when I think about the challenges we face, we've got a security policy, and then you might have a government policy for Bill Clinton. And the challenges we face as security professionals about how do I get that policy out to the relevant audience, but not just how I get it out to them, but how do we actually make it engaging enough that there's a strong chance that they're going to remember it at the point that they have to remember it. And then I think back to what you were doing with, with your speechwriting with Bill Clinton was, we've got this national policy, but how do we get it out to the audience? How do we get the audience to take that on board? And I just see parallels or analogy between what you do and the challenges that we face within the industry. So I think a lot of what you've said today will be of considerable insight for them. And I'd like to thank you for spending some time and sharing that with us.
Well, Bruce, thank you for having me, and thank you for helping people see the power of analogy, because those who master analogy master the world, and we need smart new insights because goodness knows there are enough rocky paths that we could go down if we're not careful. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolute pleasure. Always good to talk to you. And thanks very much for taking part and sharing your thoughts, John.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the chat that we just had with John Pollock, the speechwriter to the ex-US President Bill Clinton. As always, as we're having those conversations, I like to take as many notes as possible. And on this occasion, John did us absolutely proud. I think I've got 4 pages of notes, but I'm not going to give you the full rundown on all the 4 pages of notes. But I am just going to pick out a couple of points which I thought were worthy of interest, but to be quite frank, they were all really worthy of interest. But anyway, here's just a couple of points for you to take away and to consider when you're back in the office. So the first thing I think I'd like to pick up upon was the point he was making about the value of having empathy towards the audience and how that really helps drive a genuine level of engagement with an audience. And, John pointed to the fact that Bill Clinton was such a successful public speaker because of his empathy with the audience. And the point of empathy is really important today because Alex Stormos from Facebook has today at Black Hat stood on the stage as the keynote presenter, opening up the conference and alluding to the fact that as an industry, we all have to have empathy with employees, with personnel, with users, and that actually the biggest opportunity for advancement in terms of security is not within the technical realm, but it's actually within the human domain. And he used the word on the need to have empathy specifically within his presentation. So I think it's great. We've got John Pollock, speechwriter to Bill Clinton, and we've got Alex Stormos from Facebook basically saying exactly the same thing. The second point I would allude to was sort of really stems off or comes off the back of the quote that John gave us, where he said, Washington is where good words go to die. And what he meant by that was a reflection on how corporate communication guidelines and policy can often completely strip away the emotion, which is what makes communication engaging and makes it more likely to actually influence behaviours. And do you know what? He's the third guest that we've had who's said exactly the same thing. Gregory Michaelidos and Heather Dahl, they reflected on that very, very same point. So, maybe there's something there that needs to happen in terms of conversation. The next one I would pick up upon was John's reflection upon the importance of actually building up a relationship with your audience. And that building that relationship up means that not only is the communication going from security to the to employees or to personnel, but it's also about being savvy enough to be aware of what personnel and employees are saying about security. So, it's a two-way communication. And John alluded to that with some great examples. And then almost the final point, he mentioned about being authentic. And by being authentic, what he meant is that, not only saying something, not going to communicate a particular message, but actually living that. And, often in workshops that I attend, one of the things that people highlight is that, the concern that employees have when they see other people, specifically more senior managers, breaking policy, yet saying that policy is really important. And it's that sort of sense of that's not really authentic. Security is not authentic. We say these things, but we don't actually live them. And there are examples that people can point to about, where maybe more senior members of a team actually just don't live the policy. So he alluded to the fact that you've got to be authentic about your communication and you've got to be authentic about actually your delivery. And that if you are this, that basically ramps up your credibility. Now, the great thing about credibility is that as credibility builds, you become seen as more of an authority. And anybody that's been to any of my sort of behavioural insights workshops will know that this is one of the principles of behavioural science, that, being seen as the authority is a surefire means of influencing people's decisions. So, that's really, really important. And then I guess the final point really span out of a conversation around, analogies. John and I both love analogies, and we've spent quite a lot of time looking into the science behind why analogies work. But I think the thing that John really alluded to was that sometimes the answer to some of our challenge is in how we frame the challenge, how we see the challenge within that frame. And he gave a great example of how a Model T Ford would take, I think it was 12 or 15 hours to make. And obviously the cost of that in terms of labour and parts, etc., meant that most cars were beyond the reach of the average man and woman on the street. Now, one of the engineers went and saw a meat packing factory where, you got the animals would come in one end and at the other end, they would come out as, packaged meats. And he learned from that process within that meat factory and took those ideas out and applied them to the car manufacturing. And they completely shrunk the amount of time it took to make the car. And with that came the economies of scale. And with the economies of scale came a collapsing in the price of the actual car in terms of its retail price, which meant suddenly a lot more people were able to access the car and the benefits that maybe a car back then was considered to bring. And that was all down to seeing things differently. And that's one of the things I guess we're trying to do here with the podcast, inviting people in who have faced the challenge of awareness, behavioural culture, or maybe all three, but have done that outside of the security industry predominantly, and sort of using them as a different way of framing the challenge that we face within our industry. So anyway, there are 5 or 6 key points. I hope you found this of interest. If you did, and you want to know more about the podcast, the best way to stay in contact with us is to go to the Marmalade Box website, www.marmaladeboxcom, sign up to the newsletter. The newsletter comes out every month, and in the newsletter, there's a hash of all our blogs and articles relating to security awareness, behaviour and culture, articles from third parties that we think are really interesting and informative. We also have the links to the latest podcast there. We also have now a new feature where I talk very briefly about one of the books which has significantly impacted my own personal view on the challenges around education and awareness, behaviour and culture. And we also include within that the opportunity for you to raise a question, and we will answer that question in forthcoming podcast. The other way to stay in contact with us is to go to the Marmalade Box page and group on LinkedIn. And the other way is, if you use Twitter, is to follow us on Twitter at Marmalade Box. And we are pretty active on there in terms of raising awareness about, again, the blogs that we do and the articles we find interesting and the new podcast. So on a final point for you, a really exciting point is, who is our next guest? Well, our next guest is a gentleman by the name of Robert Mandolin. Now, you're probably not aware of Robert, but he has played a significant part in the development of European policy on health and digital. He did that in his capacity as the Director General of the Digital and Health Agenda within the European Commission. He's also working with the World Economic Forum and particularly interested in how we apply behavioral science and behavioral insights and behavioral economics, something that I'm absolutely passionate about, and I always apply within the work that I do around education and awareness. And that's what first brought us together. Now, Robert's got a really, really interesting background, and he'll allude to that in the interview that we do have with him. But, this man has been responsible for, helping formulate policy, helping people become aware of the existence of that policy, helping influence behaviors to comply with these better health choices and better digital choices, and also embedding that across, 27 different states with different cultures. So he has some experience in the challenges that we face. So I hope you can enjoy myself and Robert. The podcast should go out towards the end of August. And in the meantime, please follow us up on Twitter, join with us on LinkedIn, or sign up to our newsletter. Have a great August. If you're on holiday, really, really enjoy it. And we will hopefully be in contact with you upon your return. Many thanks.